Hey everybody, it's Shelly from Shelly Read Stuff, and I'm coming to you with the mid-year plus a couple weeks Freakout tag that's going around on Bookstagram and on BookTube right now. So I'm going to show you the best books that I've read so far this year in 2020. Alright, so the first question in this tag is the best book that you've read so far in 2020. And I have two, and both of them were on Audible or on audio, and I got them both from the library on RB Digital. And so I don't actually have the physical book here. I don't have a lot of these physical books that I'm going to talk about in this video because I do a lot of library stuff. And you know, if I read the book in February, I don't have it in July to show it to you. But I'll put up some pictures over here so that you can still see what they look like. So the first one that I loved this year was Confessions of a Domestic Failure. And I sometimes feel like I'm that mom that does not have everything together. And so I love reading books where the main character is something sort of similar to me and she doesn't have her stuff together. And so Ashley is one of these moms. Like, she really, really wants to be a good mom and a great mom. But you know, just stuff happens and she puts a lot of expectations on herself, but her house is a mess and her daughter isn't perfect and why can't she be this? And so she starts following this blogger and buys this blogger's book and tries to do all of these steps and all of these things to be the perfect mom. And it's hilarious. It's written in diary form. It's just I wouldn't say it's a fluff book, but it's a book that's just funny and but also addresses some of these issues about like what is it like to be a mom in the Pinterest, Instagram world where everybody seems like they have it more together than you do. So, and then the second one is very different, is The Invention of Wings by Sue Monk Kidd, and this one is about the Grimke sisters who were real people, and they were abolitionists and suffragettes, that's a hard word to say, suffragettes in the early 1800s, even though they were Southerners. And it kind of follows the story of these two sisters, and she also weaves into the story the older sister's slave girl that she's given on her 11th birthday, but she doesn't want. And it just really made me think, especially now with everything that's going on with Black Lives Matter, like, why didn't people speak up about this in like 1820? And why weren't more people like the Grimke sisters? And, you know, what are the things historically that have led us to this point in time where we are now, almost 200 years later, and similar things are still happening in our country. But it was a hopeful book, and it was very well written, well researched, well told. I love strong female characters, and I say that pretty much in every single video that I've done, but I just really liked these characters and the fact that they were doing things that they felt were right, not necessarily what society told them that they should be as women. So those are my two favorite books so far in 2020. All right, the next question is, what book did you read that was a sequel? And I didn't read a lot of sequels looking back over the books that I've read, the 50-ish books that I've read so far this year. But I did start reading and then read the next three Sabrina Flynn mystery series. And these are, Sabrina Flynn is the author. And these are series with the detective's name is Atticus Riot, like best name of a detective ever. It takes place in San Francisco in the early 1900s, and Atticus has kind of a storied past that you learn about over the course of at least the 4 books that I read. But he's come back to San Francisco. He's been gone for a while, but he comes back to San Francisco, and he is trying to, in this first book, solve the disappearance of Mrs. Kingston. And she's this wealthy socialite that's gone missing, and there's lots of twists and turns, and there's lots of different intrigue and characters who aren't what you think they are, and I didn't see in the first book, which is From the Ashes, I did not pick out who the mastermind was behind the the whole like crime plan, murder drama whole thing until the end, and I was like, oh my gosh, she did such a great job of like leading us down the path but not giving us enough clues that we wouldn't be surprised by the ending. And I love books that surprise me because it doesn't happen very often. So those are the Atticus Riot Mysteries by Sabrina Flynn, and the first four are From the Ashes, A Bitter Draught, Record of Blood, and Conspiracy of Silence. And there's a fifth one, but I haven't read them. And I read them in January, like literally 1, 2, 3, 4, like right after each other. And I got those on my Kindle. I think that the first one was like one of the 99-cent Kindle deals, and that's why I started down this path. But those were really, really good. If you like mystery and some historical fiction, then this is a series you might want to check out. All right, the third question is, name a book that's a new release that you haven't read yet. And I actually have this book, like a physical book, because I got tired of waiting for it from the library and waiting for my friends to be finished with it. So this one is The Book of Longings by Sue Monk Kidd. And no surprise, she's one of my favorite authors. I mean, one of my favorite books this year was Invention of Wings. So this one, since it came out, I have had somebody message me, email me, talk to me, text me about this book every couple of days or so. They want to know what I think of it. Haven't read it yet, so I don't know. But I think that they want my opinion because I work at a church. I'm a pastor's wife, so I'm a Christian, Jesus believer, and since this book is, in addition to being a reader of lots of things and loving this author, and since this book kind of like brings all of those things together, people keep telling me, have you read the Book of Longings? Have you read the Book of Longings? Have you read the Book of Longings? And I keep saying, no, no, no. So this is my book that after I do the Reading Rush Challenge next week, this is next on my list to read, the Book of Longings. But that's my book that's a new release that I haven't read yet that I'm looking forward to reading. Question 4 is the most anticipated new release for the rest of 2020. And while there's a lot of really good books coming out that I'm excited about, I'm going to read kind of my list here. So, The Lions of Fifth Avenue by Fiona Davis, who's one of my favorite authors, and I've read everything that she's put out so far, and I love her books and how they incorporate buildings and locations as another character, and again, historical fiction. One by One by Ruth Ware, because, you know, Ruth Ware, like, again, read everything that she's written. Great thriller writer, edge of your seat, mystery, what's going to happen, surprise endings, that kind of thing. But the book that I've been anticipating since October of 2019 is Majesty by Katherine McGee. Okay, so I read American Royals last year on a trip to Mexico on my Kindle. Fell in love with it. Fell in love with the concept of alternate history, alternate reality, where so the concept is that, let's say George Washington decided he wanted to be king instead of saying, no, that's not what we want for our country. And so now jump forward to 2020-ish, and we have the Washington family, and they are going through some turmoil about who's going to marry their daughters, and they're prepping their daughter to be the first queen because we've never had a queen, but there's the Washington royal family. And when I finished the book, I was like, no, this doesn't wrap it up, and it just makes it a cliffhanger. And so I looked it up, and I was like, no, the next book doesn't come out until next year in September. So I've already pre-ordered it. It's going to come to my house on September 1st. Thank you, Amazon. And so that is my most anticipated book that's coming out this year. And I will probably sit down, ditch whatever I'm reading on September 1st, and sit down and just read the whole thing, the whole second book. So that's my anticipation book. Okay, question 5 is, what has been your biggest disappointment read this year? Because if we talked about biggest disappointments this year of COVID, like, I could just go on for a 20-minute video about disappointments. But as far as read goes, I would say it's The Chelsea Girls by Fiona Davis. Now, here's why. Was it the worst book I read this year so far? Definitely not. Very well written, good storyline, has to do with spies, theater in New York City, all kinds of fun stuff. But it didn't have that building as a character thing that I love that Fiona Davis does. So I was really disappointed that she didn't flesh out the Chelsea Hotel as much as she could have, or as she's done in her previous works. It also had two different voices, but they weren't in different times, like that I'm used to her doing. So I guess my disappointment comes from reading other Fiona Davis stuff and then not having that in the Chelsea Girls. Still a good book, just not what I was expecting, and I was disappointed because part of the reason why I like her writing is that I love New York City, and I love learning about these historical buildings and the architecture and how they were built and why they were built and what they looked like in their heyday and things like that, and I just felt like that was lacking in the Chelsea Girls. Okay, the next question is a new author or a new to you author that you've discovered so far this year, and one of them is somebody I've discovered, and one of them is somebody that I've finally read that I've wanted to read for a long time. So first of all, the one I discovered that I haven't read of or hadn't heard of before is Carrie Vaughn. And she's, like, I looked at her stuff. She's a prolific writer. But I just had never even heard of her, never read her stuff. So I was looking for audiobooks to listen to, obviously audiobooks to listen to, but I was looking for a new audiobook, and I came across Bannerless, and it said that it was a post-apocalyptic mystery. And I'm like, I'm here for both those things. So I read Bannerless, and then I read the second book, The Wild Dead, or listened to it, The Wild Dead, and they're both very good. The first book, Bannerless, does a lot of world building, so there's a lot of flashback to when the main character was younger, so that you could understand the world that she's living in now. It's might hit a little close to home for some of us, because it's 100 years after there was a major plague that killed most of the earth, and it's like, now what is it like 100 years later? And she's a police officer and goes around to different communities investigating when the communities themselves can't settle their disputes. So she goes, in the first one, Bannerless, she goes to settle a suspicious death kind of thing, and then uncovers some other conspiracy stuff while she's there. And then in The Wild Dead, I'm not going to tell you what happens because it's a surprise partway through the book, but she goes to something minor that she thinks is minor, but it turns out to be a major issue in this small community. So that's Carrie Vaughn and Bannerless and The Wild Dead, 2 different books. And then somebody that I've wanted to read for a long time that I just never have gotten around to reading, and I had this book on my Kindle probably for 2+ years, is Jillian Cantor. I love historical fiction. How I have not read Jillian Cantor before this, I have no idea. Also, she lives 20 minutes from my house. She's a Southern Arizona, person. The reason why I came across her a couple years ago is because we have this huge book festival in Tucson, the Tucson Festival of Books, every year in March, and she always is there because she's a local author. And I always try to read a bunch of books from authors that I'm going to go and hear speak at the Tucson Festival of Books. So I downloaded The Lost Letter last year in preparation to go and hear her talk. I decided to not get tickets for the talk where she was, so I decided not to read that book. Dumb mistake. Should have read the book because it's fantastic. Everything that I love, multiple perspectives, strong female characters, a secret that nobody knows, World War II, timelines intersecting, all those things. So I was glad that I finally read a Jillian Cantor book, and that I will definitely be reading more Jillian Cantor. Okay, the next question is fictional crush. This one doesn't really fit my personality. I'm not somebody that's falls in love with characters in books. I will even come straight out and tell you that I don't get, and you know what? You're probably going to slam me in the comments, but sorry. I don't get the fascination with Mr. Darcy. I don't get the fascination with Edward in Twilight. Like, that is not why I read. So I don't really have a fictional crush just because that's not how my brain processes when I read. I totally get people that like that. I was prepping for this and my son said, well, you should just talk about Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man. I'm like, but that doesn't have anything to do with what I read. So, but I just don't get into the crush kind of thing. Maybe because I like flawed characters. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe that's what it is. So I don't really have an answer for this one. So question 8 is your favorite characters. And I literally just changed this because I was going to say the Dutch house because I like the brother-sister dynamics in that book and how they interact with each other. And I listened to it, read by Tom Hanks. I mean, that just makes characters come to life. But I just changed my mind. I still like the Dutch house, but I just changed my mind. And I'm going to go with the Chilbury Ladies Choir. Maybe because I was a pastor's wife in a tiny little town, kind of like this book takes place in this tiny little town in England, and there's all these characters that are associated with this ladies choir that sing in this church, and I'm like, I know these people. They were in our church. They're in the church I work in now. They were just so real to me. And I wanted to go and like hang out with them, and I want to sing in the ladies choir with them. They do all these cool, fun stuff. Like they travel, and they're like the USO sort of version of like Southwest England. But it was really interesting, and all different kinds of characters. So you've got like a 13-year-old girl who has a crush on this guy with this weird love triangle with she likes him and he likes her sister, and like this whole weird thing like that. You have the lady who's a widow who's sending off her only son off to war. You have kind of the town deviant, and she's blackmailing a bunch of people. You have the older sister of the 13-year-old who's dealing with some of her own stuff and her first real love. It's this great cast of characters. It's told in letters, diary entries, and like public notices. So it's an interesting format as well. But that's the Chilbury Ladies Choir, and those are the people I just want to hang out with. I just want to hang out with them. All right, question number 9 is a book that made you cry. I rarely cry at books, but I will say this. I get indignant about books sometimes. So I'm going to say this is a book that made me feel just like angry. I have a couple of ones that made me feel angry, but I'm going to go with this one because I wrote it on my list. So it was The Lost Girls of Paris. And until I started doing this, I didn't realize how many World War II books I've read this year. I mean, I've read a ton of World War II. And there's a ton of World War II books out there, but I have read a lot of World War II this year. So that might be something for me to pay attention to. But anyway, The Lost Girls of Paris made me very angry, especially since it was based on a true story. It's based on true people, and I was just, how could they, to the English government at the end of this book. So it's about these girls that they send in behind enemy lines in France. They're part of the spy network. They work with the resistance. They are trained and things like that, but they're dropped behind enemy lines and then kind of left to fend for themselves a little bit and try to figure out like how they can help the resistance and make their own contacts and things like that. So it's a little bit, if you've read Codename Verity, a little bit Codename Verity kind of feel to it. But it was really good and really well written, and I was just, why did they treat them like this kind of at the end of that book? All right, question 10 is a pretty book that you bought. So I'm in a reading group, and we do challenges every month, and that's our challenge this month is to judge a book by its cover, which I talked about in, I think I talked about it in a previous video. I don't know. I put it up on my Instagram, Shelly Reads Stuff on Instagram. But this one, I was looking at my shelves, and I'm like, this is a really pretty book, and I haven't actually read it yet, but I think that the cover is amazing. So this is The Miniaturist, And the cover just tells a lot about the book in general. I mean, obviously, like, Elizabethan times. Yep, 1689. It's a little bit after Elizabeth. Like, London-ish, bird. It's kind of like, I like dark books. It's kind of dark. Mystery-y kind of feel to it. So, but I thought that this was really, really pretty cover of a book. Yeah, so now that I'm almost done with this mid-year freakout, I realized that I skipped a question way back at the beginning. Number 6, which is a book that surprised you. So, yeah, I could just put this part in there, but I said other numbers. I don't know. It's just a mess. Just pay attention to the questions in the books and forget about the number of the questions, like, after 3 or 4. So, you know, I make notes, but it helps if you actually read the notes as you're doing the videos. Anyway, I think I skipped another question too, but I'll check in a second. So this is my book that surprised me. Again, I take off the covers. But I'm thinking that maybe I shouldn't do that anymore so that you guys can see them. But anyway, this one's called The Shadowland, and it's by the same person that wrote The Historian. So if you are familiar with that book. But this book surprised me. First of all, it took me a long time to read it. I got it at a library fill your bag for $5 sale a couple of years ago. But it's like 500 pages, and I just didn't want to read 500 pages through Husband, so it's just been sitting on my shelf. But I picked it up earlier this year, and so glad that I did, because this book, I don't know, it was in the running for being best book of this year, as well, on my list, best book so far. But this book was, so the premise is really interesting, and the location is really interesting to me. So the premise is, it takes place in Bulgaria, which I knew very little about, except for that it's in the eastern part of Europe. And it was behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. But, like, other than that, I was like, I know nothing about Bulgaria. So the premise of this book is that the main character gets dropped off after flying there from the United States. She flies from the United States all the way to Bulgaria because she's going to spend a year teaching English. She knows no Bulgarian. She's, like, exhausted because it's international flights and blah, 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 and all these other things, and she just wants to get to her hotel. Her cab driver that doesn't speak any English and she doesn't speak any Bulgarian drops her off at the wrong hotel. So as she's waiting for another cab, she sees this elderly couple and another gentleman coming down the stairs, and she goes to help them with their luggage and helps get them into a cab and that kind of thing. And they leave, and she realizes that they've left a piece of their luggage next to her luggage as they got into the cab. So it was like mixed up. They didn't take anything of hers, but she has this extra luggage. So she finds a cab driver to take her to her supposed to be hotel. And as they're going, she opens up the bag to see if there's any identification in there so that she can get the bag back to the people. And she realizes that what's in the bag is an urn of ashes. So she and the cab driver decide that they are going to find out who this belongs to, because it's important. You know, it's not like just like somebody's toothbrush. It's important to get this urn back to who it belongs to. So that sends them on this quest, like, all over Bulgaria. Like, they are everywhere. So as they're trying to track down who this person was and try to track down his family and all these other things, like, stuff keeps happening to them. They're always one step behind the family, so they have to go another place. But I learned so much about Bulgaria. Like, I didn't know, like, anything about, like, what the land looks like, what, you know, seaside, Black Sea village. And so I was Googling pictures of Bulgaria and reading about what was Bulgaria like behind the Iron Curtain, because that comes into play in the story too. But it was just, now I want to go to Bulgaria, and I wouldn't have said that, like, before, like, go to Bulgaria, like Eastern Europe, like maybe Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic, but Bulgaria, I don't know. But It was really good, and the author actually lives in Bulgaria, so she's very knowledgeable about writing about that part of the world. But that was the book that was surprising to me, both in location and in story premise. So, The Shadowland. All right, looking back at my notes, another skipped question was the book that made you happy. And I already talked about this one, but it is the Confessions of a Domestic Failure. It made me laugh out loud. It just was really feel good, and the way she tells stories, it is so true to my life and my motherhood journey that I couldn't help but laugh at how she describes some of the things. But I already talked about that in one of my favorite books for this year. So the last question is, what books do you want to read by the end of the year? So one of them is the Book of Longings, which I already talked about. But then I have 2 other books that I want to read before the end of the year. One of them is The Guest List, just because I keep hearing so many things about it, and it just seems like it's right in my wheelhouse. Thriller, quick read, like all those things that I love in a book. Okay, and then the other one is that I absolutely adore Erik Larson and have read everything that Erik Larson has written, and I need to read his new book, which is The Splendid and the Vile. All right, so that about wraps it up with the crazy out of order questions and the weird numbering, but whatever. Got the questions answered, told you guys what I've been reading, told you guys what I'm looking forward to reading. So that does it for me for my mid-year book, Freakout!